Frederick Walter Stephen West, September 29, 1941, January 1, 1995, was an English serial killer who committed at least 12 murders between 1967 and 1987 in Gloucestershire, most of them with his second wife, Rose West. All the victims were young women. At least 8 of these murders involved the West's sexual gratification and included rape, bondage, torture, and mutilation. The victims' dismembered bodies were typically buried in the cellar or garden of the West residence in Gloucester, which became known as the House of Horrors. Fred is known to have committed at least 2 murders on his own. Rose is known to have murdered Fred's stepdaughter, Charmaine. The couple were arrested and charged in 1994. Fred fatally asphyxiated himself while detained on remand at Home Prison, Birmingham on January 1, 1995, at which time he and Rose were jointly charged with 9 murders, and he with 3 further murders. In November 1995, Rose was convicted of 10 murders and sentenced to 10 life terms with a whole life order. Childhood. Frederick Walter Stephen West was born on September 29, 1941, at Bickerton Cottage, Much Marcle, Herefordshire, the first surviving child of Walter Stephen West, 1914, 1992, and Daisy Hannah Hill, 1922, 1968. Fred was from a poor family of farm workers, close-knit and mutually protective. His father was a disciplinarian and his mother overprotective. Moor Court Farm, Much Marcle, where West lived, in Moor Court Cottage, 1946, 1961. In 1946 the family moved to Moor Court Cottage, a semi-detached building adjacent to Moor Court Farm, on the outskirts of Much Marcle, where Fred's father worked as a milking herdsman and harvest hand. The cottage had no electricity and was heated by a log fire. By 1951 Fred's mother had given birth to 8 children, 6 of whom survived. Fred was always his mother's favorite. He was seen as a mother's boy and relied mostly on his siblings for companionship. The West children were expected to perform assigned chores and all 6 did seasonal work, the 3 girls picking hops and strawberries, the 3 boys harvesting wheat and hunting rabbits. The necessity of working to earn a living and to survive instilled a strong work ethic in Fred, who also developed a lifelong habit of petty theft. Classmates recall Fred as scruffy, dim, lethargic, and regularly in trouble. Throughout his life, he remained barely literate, yet displayed an aptitude for woodwork and artwork. He left school in December 1956 at the age of 15, first working as a laborer at Moor Court Farm. Fred later claimed that he had been introduced to sex by his mother at 12, that he had engaged in acts with animals in his early teens, and that his belief that incest was normal stemmed from his father's incest with Fred's sisters. Fred's youngest brother, Doug, dismissed these claims as fantasy. Adolescence. By 1957, Fred and his brother John frequently socialized at a youth club in nearby Ledbury, where his distinct and guttural Herefordshire accent marked him as a country bumpkin. He aggressively pestered women and girls, whom he objectified as sources of pleasure to be used as he saw fit, and would abruptly approach and fondle them. When a girl accepted his advances, she would find his sexual performance unsatisfying, as his primary objective was his own gratification. At age 17, Fred suffered a fractured skull, a broken arm, and a broken leg in a motorcycle accident. He was unconscious for 7 days and walked with braces for several months. Because of this incident, he developed an extreme fear of hospitals and became prone to fits of rage. 2 years later, Fred suffered a further head injury when a girl he groped on a fire escape outside the Ledbury Youth Club punched him, sending him falling 2 floors. In June 1961, Fred's 13-year-old sister, Kitty, told her mother that Fred had been raping her since the previous December, and had impregnated her. Arrested the same month, Fred freely admitted to police he had been molesting young girls since his early teens and asked, "Doesn't everybody do it?" He was tried on November 9 at Herefordshire Assizes. Though disgusted by her son's actions, Fred's mother had been prepared to testify in his defense. Immediately prior to her scheduled testimony, Kitty changed her mind and refused to testify, and the case collapsed. Much of Fred's family effectively disowned him. His mother banished him from the household, and he moved into the Much Marcle house of his Aunt Violet. By mid-1962, He had reconciled with his parents, but his relationship with most of his family remained fraught. Marriage. Fred became reacquainted with Catherine, Rena, Bernadette Costello 21 in September 1962, when he was 21. He had first met Costello, who came from Coatbridge, Lanarkshire 22 at a Muchmarkel dance hall in 1960, and dated her for several months before she returned to Scotland. Costello was pregnant by an Asian bus driver at the time of her marriage to Fred, and may have relocated from Glasgow to England due to members of her family expressing their displeasure at her being pregnant with a mixed-race child. She married Fred in Ledbury on November 17, the sole guest being Fred's younger brother John. The couple initially lived in Fred's aunt's home, then moved to Coatbridge, where Fred worked as an ice cream van driver. Rena's daughter, Charmaine, was born in March 1963. To explain the child's mixed ancestry, Rena and Fred claimed that she had suffered a miscarriage and that Charmaine was adopted. Shortly thereafter, the couple relocated to Savoy Street, in the Bridgeton district of Glasgow. In July 1964, Rena bore Fred a daughter, Anna Marie. The child was born at the couple's Savoy Street home. The family nanny, Isa McNeil, and neighbors of the Wests, recall Rena as a considerate mother struggling to bring up two children. Fred treated the children harshly. He kept the girls in the bottom of a bunk bed with bars fitted to the space between the bunks, effectively caging them. They were allowed out only when he was at work. Via McNeil, the Wests became acquainted with her friend, 16-year-old Anne McFall, who was despondent over the death of her boyfriend in a workplace accident. McFall spent a great deal of time at the Wests' flat. Any ordinary man would have given the child some ice cream, but instead he smashed her round the head with his hand. He was a violent and sadistic bastard who enjoyed beating up women and kids. John McLaughlin, 1995. Fred later admitted to having engaged in numerous affairs in the early years of his marriage, and fathered one illegitimate child with a woman from the Gorbals. When Rena discovered her husband's infidelity, she began an affair with a man named John McLaughlin. On one occasion, Fred discovered the pair in an embrace. He punched Rena, making her scream. In response, McLaughlin punched Fred, who drew a knife and grazed McLaughlin's abdomen. When punched by McLaughlin a second time, Fred stopped defending himself. Years later, McLaughlin recollected this incident. He couldn't tackle a man, but he wasn't so slow in attacking women. He and Rena continued their affair, and McLaughlin became increasingly aghast at Rena's bruises and black eyes. On each occasion it became apparent Fred had beaten his wife. McLaughlin extensively beat Fred. In another instance, McLaughlin witnessed Charmaine, little older than a toddler, ask Fred for an ice cream from his van. In response, Fred struck her across the head, triggering another beating from McLaughlin. On November 4, 1965, Fred accidentally ran over and killed a small boy in Glasgow with his van. He was cleared of any wrongdoing by police, but feared the hostile reaction and potential reprisals for the accident from the locals, whom he relied upon to make his living. In December he returned to Gloucester with Charmaine and Anna Marie, renting a caravan at the Timberland Caravan Park in Bishop's Cleeve. Rena joined him in February 1966, accompanied by McNeil and McFall, who also moved into Fred's caravan. McNeil and McFall both came from impoverished backgrounds. Both hoped to find work in England. Shortly after the move south, Fred found employment driving a lorry for a local abattoir. By early 1966, Fred had begun to exhibit dominance and control over all three women. He was also prone to violent mood swings, and Rena and McNeil typically bore the brunt of his fury. Fred also physically attacked his stepdaughter more than once. He is also reported to have begun sexually abusing Charmaine, and to have encouraged Rena to turn to prostitution to supplement his meager income. To escape Fred's domestic abuse and increasingly sadistic sexual demands, Rena phoned McLaughlin, begging him to rescue her, McNeil and her children. Together, McLaughlin, Rena, and McNeil devised a plan. He and McNeil's boyfriend, John Trotter, would secretly drive to Bishop's Cleeve in McLaughlin's Mini and discreetly take Rena, her children, and McNeil back to Scotland. McFall had by this stage become infatuated with Fred, who had promised to marry her. It is likely she informed Fred of the plan, as he arrived at the meeting time. and McFall was oddly calm as she informed McNeil she intended to remain with Fred to work as the children's nanny. An altercation ensued between Fred and McLaughlin, resulting in Fred being struck several times as he clutched onto Charmaine and Anna Marie. Police were called and McLaughlin, Trotter, McNeil, and Rena left, with Fred threatening to kill Rena should he ever see her again. To ensure her daughter's well-being, Rena frequently traveled to England to visit Charmaine and Anna Marie while they lived with Fred at Bishop's Cleeve. Despite initially maintaining her friendship with McFall, Rena soon began to resent her matriarchal presence around her daughters. On October 11th, in an act of resentment, Rena stole some belongings from Fred's caravan and returned to Glasgow. She was arrested the following month and returned to Gloucester to face trial. On November 29th, Rena was sentenced to 3 years probation. Fred testified at the hearing, admitting he and McFall were living together, but falsely claiming McFall intended to return to Scotland imminently. After the trial, McFall moved into a caravan at the Timberland Caravan Park. Rena alternated between living with Fred and returning to Glasgow. Letters McFall posted to her family and McNeil in Glasgow between 1966 and 1967 indicate she believed a relationship with Fred could offer her a better life than that she had experienced in Scotland, and she tried to persuade Fred to divorce his wife in order that he could marry her. Murder of Anne McFall. In July 1967, McFall, aged 18 and 8 months pregnant with Fred's child, vanished. She was never reported missing, but her dismembered remains were found buried at the edge of a cornfield between Muchmarkel and Kempley in June 1994. Her limbs had been carefully disarticulated, and many phalange bones were missing from her body, likely to have been retained as keepsakes. Her unborn child may also have been cut from her womb. Fred initially denied he had killed McFall, but confided to one visitor following his arrest that he had stabbed her to death following an argument. This explanation is inconsistent with the fact that her wrists were found with sections of dressing gown cord wrapped around them, suggesting she had been restrained prior to her murder. The following month, Rena returned to live with Fred, and the couple relocated to the Lake House Caravan Park. Their relationship initially improved, but Rena left the following year, again leaving the children in his care. On these occasions when Fred had no woman to supervise and care for the girls, he temporarily placed them in the care of Gloucestershire Social Services. Rosemary Letts. Main article, Rose West. Fred first encountered Rosemary Letts in early 1969, shortly after her 15th birthday. The pair first met while waiting for the same bus in Cheltenham. Initially, Rose was repulsed by Fred's unkempt appearance and deduced he was a tramp, but she quickly became flattered by the attention Fred continued to lavish on her over the following days, as he invariably sat alongside her at the same bus stop. Rose twice refused to go on a date with Fred, but allowed him to accompany her home. In their initial conversations, Fred quickly discovered that although Rose had never had a boyfriend, she was overtly promiscuous. He also extracted a degree of sympathy from her by claiming he and his 2 daughters had been abandoned by his wife, and that he wished for more children. Having discovered Rose worked in a nearby bread shop, a few days after their first encounter, Fred persuaded an unknown woman to enter the premises and present her with a gift, accompanied by the explanation that a man outside had asked her to present this gift to her. Minutes later, Fred entered the premises and asked Rose to accompany him on a date that evening, an offer she accepted. Shortly thereafter, Rose began a relationship with Fred, becoming a frequent visitor at the Lake House Caravan Park and a willing childminder to Charmaine and Anna Marie, whom she noted were neglected and whom she initially treated with care and affection. On several occasions in the early days of their courtship, Rose insisted she and Fred take the girls on excursions to gather wildflowers. Within weeks of her first meeting Fred, Rose left her job at the bread shop in order to become the nanny to Charmaine and Anna Marie. This decision was made with the agreement that Fred would provide her with sufficient money to give to her parents on Fridays to convince them she was still obtaining a salary at the bread shop. Several months later, Rose introduced Fred to her family, who were aghast at their daughter's choice of partner. Rose's mother, Daisy Letts, was unimpressed with Fred's braggadocio, and correctly concluded he was a pathological liar. Her father, Bill Letts, a diagnosed schizophrenic who is believed to have molested his daughter, vehemently disapproved of the relationship, threatening Fred directly and promising to call social services if he continued to date Rose. Relationship. Rose's parents forbade their daughter from continuing to date Fred, but she defied their wishes, prompting them to visit Gloucestershire Social Services to explain that their 15-year-old daughter was dating an older man, and that they had heard rumors that she had begun to engage in prostitution at his caravan. In response, Rose was placed in a home for troubled teenagers in Cheltenham in August 1969, and only allowed to leave under controlled conditions. When allowed to return home to visit her parents at weekends, Rose almost invariably took the opportunity to visit Fred. On her 16th birthday, Rose left the home for troubled teenagers to return to her parents, Fred at the time serving a 30-day sentence for theft and unpaid fines. Upon Fred's release, Rose left her parents' home to move into the Cheltenham flat Fred then lived in. Shortly thereafter, Fred collected Charmaine and Anna Marie from social services. Bill Letts made one final effort to prevent his daughter from seeing Fred, and Rose was examined by a police surgeon in February 1970, who confirmed she was pregnant. In response, Rose was again placed into care, but was discharged on March 6 on the understanding she would terminate her pregnancy and return to her family. Instead, Rose opted to live with Fred, resulting in her father forbidding his daughter from ever again setting foot in his household. 3 months later, the couple vacated the Cheltenham flat and relocated to the ground floor flat of a 2-story house in Midland Road, Gloucester. On October 17, 1970, Rose gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Heather Ann. Speculation remains that Heather may have been sired by Rose's own father. 57 2 months later, Fred was imprisoned for the theft of car tires and a vehicle tax. 58 He remained imprisoned until June 24, 1971. As he served this 6.5-month sentence, Rose, having just turned 17, looked after the 3 girls, with Charmaine and Anna Marie being told to refer to Rose as their mother. According to Anna Marie, she and Charmaine were frequently subjected to criticism, beatings, and other forms of punishment throughout the time they lived under Rose's care at Midland Road. Although Anna Marie was generally submissive and prone to display emotion in response to the physical and mental hardships she and her sister endured, Charmaine repeatedly infuriated Rose by her stoic refusal to either cry or display any sign of grief or servitude no matter how severely she was physically punished. Despite the years of neglect and abuse, Charmaine's spirit had not been broken, and she talked wistfully to Anna Marie of the belief she held that her mummy will come and save me. Anna Marie later recollected her sister repeatedly antagonized Rose by making statements such as, "My real mummy wouldn't swear or shout at us," in response to Rose's scathing language. A childhood friend of Charmaine's named Tracy Giles, who had lived in the upper flat of 25 Midland Road, would later recollect an incident in which she had entered the West's flat, unannounced, only to see Charmaine, naked and standing upon a chair, gagged and with her hands bound behind her back with a belt, as Rose stood alongside the child with a large wooden spoon in her hand. According to Giles, Charmaine had been calm and unconcerned, while Anna Marie had been standing by the door with a blank expression on her face. Hospital records reveal Charmaine had received treatment for a severe puncture wound to her left ankle in the casualty unit of the Gloucester Royal Hospital on March 28, 1971. This incident was explained by Rose to have resulted from a household accident. Murder of Charmaine West. Rose is believed to have killed Charmaine shortly before Fred's prison release date of June 24, 1971. She is known to have taken Charmaine, Anna Marie, and Heather to visit Fred on June 15. It is believed to be on or very shortly after this date that Charmaine was murdered. As well as forensic odontology confirmation that Charmaine had died while Fred was still incarcerated, further testimony from Tracy Giles' mother, Shirley, corroborated the fact that Charmaine had been murdered before Fred had been released on June 24. In her later testimony at Rose's trial, Shirley stated she and her family had lived in the upper flat of Midland Road in 1971 and that her 2 daughters had been playmates of Charmaine and Anna Marie. She stated that after her family had vacated the upper flat of Midland Road in April 1971, on one day in June, she had brought Tracy to visit Charmaine, only for Tracy to be told by Rose, "She's gone to live with her mother," and bloody good riddance, before Tracy began to weep. Giles was adamant Fred was still in prison on this occasion. As with the Giles family, Rose explained Charmaine's disappearance to others who inquired about her whereabouts by claiming that Rena had called and taken her eldest daughter to live with her in Bristol. She informed staff at Charmaine's primary school that the child had moved with her mother to London. When Fred was released from prison on June 24, he allayed Anna Marie's concerns for her sister's whereabouts by claiming her mother had collected Charmaine and returned to Scotland. In her autobiography, Out of the Shadows, Anna Marie recollected that when she asked why her mother had collected Charmaine but not her, Fred callously replied, "She wouldn't want you, love. You're the wrong color." Charmaine's body was initially stowed in the coal cellar of Midland Road until Fred was released from prison. He later buried her naked body in a yard close to the back door of the flat, and remained adamant he had not dismembered her. As subsequent autopsy suggested, the body had been severed at the hip. This damage may have been caused by building work Fred conducted at the property in 1976. Several bones, particularly patelli, finger, wrist, toe, and ankle bones, were missing from her skeleton, leading to the speculation the missing parts had been retained as keepsakes. This proved to be a distinctive discovery in all the autopsies of the victims exhumed in 1994. Murder of Catherine Rena West. Rena maintained sporadic contact with her children on each occasion she and Fred separated. She is also known to have visited Moor Court Cottage to inquire as to her children's whereabouts and welfare in the latter half of August 1971. Fred's sister-in-law, Christine, later recollected Rena was depressed and extremely anxious about her children's welfare. Being provided with Fred's Midland Road address, Rena sought to confront him, likely to discuss or demand custody of her daughters. This was the final time Rena was seen alive. She is believed to have been murdered by strangulation, possibly in the back seat of Fred's Ford Popular and likely while intoxicated. When her body was discovered, a short length of metal tubing was found with her remains, leaving an equal possibility she had been restrained and subjected to a sexual assault prior to her murder. Rena's body was extensively dismembered, placed into plastic bags, and buried close to a cluster of trees known as Yew Tree Coppice at Letterbox Field, about 1 mile, 1.6 kilometers, from Much Marcle. Marriage to Letts. On January 29, 1972, Fred and Rosemary married. The ceremony took place at Gloucester Register Office, with Fred incorrectly describing himself as a bachelor upon the marriage certificate. No family or friends were invited apart from Fred's brother John, who acted as best man. Several months later, with Rose pregnant with her second child, the couple moved from Midland Road to an address nearby, 25 Cromwell Street. Initially, the 3-story home was rented from the council. Fred later purchased the property from the council for £7,000. To facilitate the Wests purchasing the property from the council, many of the upper floor rooms were initially converted into bedsits to supplement the household income. To maintain a degree of privacy for his own family, Fred installed a cooker and a wash basin on the first-floor landing in order that their lodgers need not enter the ground floor where the West family lived, and only he and his family were permitted access to the garden of the property. On June 1, Rose gave birth to a second daughter. The date of her birth led Fred and Rose to name the child May-June. Prostitution. Shortly after giving birth to her second child, Rose began to work as a prostitute, operating from an upstairs room at their residence and advertising her services in a local contact magazine. Fred encouraged Rose to seek clients in Gloucester's West Indian community through these advertisements. In addition to her prostitution, Rose engaged in casual sex with both male and female lodgers within their household, and individuals Fred encountered via his work. She also bragged to several people that no man or woman could completely satisfy her. When engaging in sexual relations with women, Rose would gradually increase the level of brutality to which she subjected her partner with acts such as partially suffocating her partner. If the woman resisted or expressed any pain or fear, this would greatly excite Rose, who would typically ask, "Aren't you woman enough to take it?" To many of these women, it became apparent Rose and her husband, who regularly participated in threesomes with his wife and her lovers, took a particular pleasure from seeking to take women beyond their sexual limits, typically via sessions involving bondage, as the Wests openly admitted to taking a particular pleasure from any form of sex involving a strong measure of dominance, pain, and violence. To cater to these fetishes, they amassed a large collection of bondage and restraining devices, magazines, and photographs, later expanding this collection to include videos depicting graphic child sexual abuse. Rose controlled the West family finances, Fred giving her his pay packets. The room Rose used for prostitution was known throughout the West household as Rose's room, and had several hidden peepholes allowing Fred, a longtime voyeur, to watch her entertain her clients. He also installed a baby monitor in the room, allowing him to listen from elsewhere in the house. The room included a private bar, and a red light outside the door warned when Rose was not to be disturbed. Rose carried the sole key to this room around her neck, and Fred installed a separate doorbell to the household which Rose's clients were instructed to ring whenever they visited the household. Much of the money earned from Rose's prostitution was spent on home improvements. By 1977, Rose's father had come to tolerate his daughter's marriage, and to develop a grudging respect for Fred. Together, he and Fred opened a cafe they named the Green Lantern, which was soon insolvent. When Bill Letts discovered Rose's prostitution, he would also visit to have sex with his daughter. By 1983, she had given birth to 8 children, at least 3 of whom were conceived by clients. Fred willingly accepted these children as his own, and falsely informed them the reason their skin was darker than that of their siblings was because his great-grandmother was a black woman. Domestic violence. When each of the West children reached the age of 7, they were assigned numerous daily chores to perform in the house. They were rarely allowed to socialize outside the household perimeters unless either of their parents were present, and had to follow strict guidelines imposed by their parents, with severe punishment, almost always physical, being the penalty for not conforming to the household rules. The children feared being the recipients of violence from their parents, the vast majority inflicted by Rose, occasionally by Fred. The violence was sometimes irrational, indiscreet, or just inflicted for Rose's gratification. She always took great care not to mark the children's faces or hands in these assaults. Heather, then her younger brother Stephen, born 1973, ran away from home. Both returned to Cromwell Street after several weeks of alternately sleeping rough or staying with friends, and both were beaten when they returned home. Between 1972 and 1992, the West children were admitted to the Accident and Emergency Department of local hospitals 31 times. The injuries were explained as accidents and never reported to social services. On one occasion, as Stephen was mopping the kitchen floor with a cloth, Rose accidentally stepped into the bowl of water he had been using. In response, Rose hit the boy over the head with a bowl, then repeatedly kicked him in the head and chest as she shouted, "You did that on purpose, you little swine." On another occasion, Rose became furious about a missing kitchen utensil, then grabbed a knife she had been using to cut a slab of meat, repeatedly inflicting light scour marks to May's chest until her rib cage was covered with light knife wounds. All the while, May screamed, "No, Mom! No, Mom!" as Stephen and Heather stood by, helplessly sobbing. Even Fred occasionally became the recipient of his wife's violence. On one occasion in August 1974, Rose chased after Fred with a carving knife in her hand. Fred was able to slam shut the door of the room into which he had run as Rose lunged at him with a knife, resulting in the knife embedding itself in the door, and 3 of Rose's fingers sliding down the blade, almost severing them from her hand. In response, Rose calmly wrapped her hand in a towel and said, "Look what you done, fella. You've got to take me to the hospital now." Initial sexual assaults. Anna Marie West. In September 1972, the Wests led 8-year-old Anna Marie to the cellar at 25 Cromwell Street where the child was ordered to undress, with Rose tearing her dress from her body upon noting the child's hesitation. She was then stripped naked, bound to a mattress and gagged before Fred raped her with Rose's active encouragement. After the rape, Rose followed Anna Marie to the bathroom laughing as she observed Anna Marie struggling to walk. She then handed her a sanitary towel, explaining to the child, "I'm sorry. Everybody does it to every girl. It's a father's job. Don't worry, and don't say anything to anybody." Making clear these sexual assaults would continue, Fred and Rose then threatened the child with severe beatings if they ever received word she had divulged the sexual abuse she endured at their hands. Rose occasionally sexually abused Anna Marie herself, and later took extreme gratification in degrading her with acts such as binding Anna Marie to various items of furniture before encouraging Fred to rape her, and forcing her to perform household chores while wearing sexual devices and a mini-skirt. From the age of 13, Fred and Rose forced Anna Marie to prostitute herself within the household, with her clients being informed Anna Marie was 16. Rose was always present in the room when these acts occurred 98 to ensure Anna Marie did not reveal her true age. On one occasion when Anna Marie was aged 13 or 14, Rose took her to a local pub, insisting she drink several glasses of barley wine. Several hours later, Fred arrived at the pub to collect Rose and Anna Marie. Once they had left the premises, Anna Marie was bundled into her father's van and beaten by Rose, who asked her, "Do you think you could be my friend?" before she was sexually abused by her father and stepmother. Caroline Owens. In October 1972, the Wests hired 17-year-old Caroline Owens as their children's nanny. They had picked her up one night on a secluded country road as she hitchhiked from Tewksbury to her Cinderford home, having visited her boyfriend. Learning that Owens disliked her stepfather and was looking for a job, the Wests offered her part-time employment as a nanny to the 3 children then in their household, with a promise she would be driven home each Tuesday. Several days later, Owens moved into 25 Cromwell Street sharing a room with Anna Marie, who Owens noted was very withdrawn. Rose, who had begun to engage in prostitution by this time, explained to Owens that she worked as a masseuse when the younger woman inquired about the steady stream of men visiting her. According to Owens, Fred also claimed to be skilled in performing abortions, should she ever need such a service. Owens also noted Fred talked about sex almost incessantly. Her suspicions as to his sexual overtones were further heightened when Fred boasted that many of the women he claimed to have performed abortions upon were so overjoyed that they would offer him their sexual services as a reward. When Owens herself became the recipient of the Wests' overt sexual advances, she announced her intentions to leave Cromwell Street and return home. Knowing Owens' habits of hitchhiking along the A40 between Cinderford and Tewksbury, the Wests formulated a plan to abduct her for their shared gratification. Fred later admitted that the specific intent of this abduction was the rape and likely murder of Owens, but that his initial incentive was to determine whether his wife would be willing to at least assist him in an abduction. On December 6, 1972, the couple lured Owens into their vehicle with an apology for their conduct and the offer of a lift home. Initially, Owens believed the Wests had been sincere in their apologies to her and obliged, believing she had simply mistaken their earlier intentions. Rose joined her in the back seat, with the explanation she wanted a girl's chat as Fred drove. Shortly thereafter, Rose began to fondle her, as Fred questioned whether she had had sex with her boyfriend that evening. When Owens began to protest, Fred stopped the car, referred to Owens as a bitch, and punched her into unconsciousness before he and Rose bound and gagged her with a scarf and duct tape. In her subsequent statement to police, Owens stated that, at Cromwell Street, she was given a drugged cup of tea to drink, then again gagged and subjected to a prolonged sexual assault from Fred and Rose. At one stage, Fred remarked that Owens' clitoris was unusual, then lashed her genitals with a leather belt. When Owens screamed, Rose again smothered her with a pillow and further restrained her about the neck before sexually assaulting her. Quickly realizing the gravity of her situation, Owens ceased resisting their sexual assaults. The following morning, having noted Owens screaming when one of his children had knocked on the door of the room in which she was restrained, Fred threatened that he and his wife would keep her locked up in the cellar and allow his black friends to abuse her, and that when they had finished, he would bury her body beneath the paving stones of Gloucester. Fred then claimed he had killed hundreds of young girls, adding that Owens had primarily been brought to the house for Rose's pleasure. He and Rose then calmly asked Owens whether she would consider returning to work as their nanny. Seeing her escape avenue, Owens agreed, and vacuumed the house to indicate her belief in becoming an extended member of the family. Later that day, Owens escaped from a laundrette she and Rose had entered and returned home. Although initially too ashamed to divulge to her mother what had happened, when her mother noted the welts, bruises, and exposed subcutaneous tissues on her daughter's body, Owens burst into tears and confided what had happened. Owens' mother immediately reported her daughter's ordeal to the police, and the Wests were arrested and charged with assault, indecent assault, actual bodily harm, and rape. The case was tried at Gloucester Magistrates Court on January 12, 1973, but by this date, Owens had decided she could not face the ordeal of testifying in court. All charges pertaining to her sexual abuse were dropped, and the Wests agreed to plead guilty to the reduced charges of indecent assault and causing actual bodily harm. Each was fined £50, and the couple were allowed to walk free from court 108 when Owens heard this news. She attempted suicide. Murders. 3 months after the West's assault trial, the couple committed their first known murder. The victim was a 19-year-old named Linda Goff, with whom Fred and Rose became acquainted through a male lodger in early 1973. Goff regularly visited Cromwell Street, and engaged in affairs with 2 male lodgers. On April 19th, she moved into their home on Cromwell Street. On or about April 20th, other tenants were told that she had been told to leave the household after she had hit one of their children. This story was later repeated to Goff's mother when she contacted the Wests to inquire about her daughter's whereabouts. When Goff's dismembered body was found, the jaw was completely wrapped in adhesive and surgical tape to silence her screams, and 2 small tubes had likely been inserted into her nasal cavities to allow breathing. Long sections of string and sections of knotted fabric were also discovered with her remains. Goff had likely been suspended from holes carved into the wooden beams supporting the ceiling of the cellar Fred later admitted he had devised for the purpose of suspending his victims' bodies, and likely died of either strangulation or suffocation. Her dismembered body, missing 5 cervical vertebrae, the patellae and numerous finger bones, was buried in an inspection pit beneath the garage. From their later investigations, police and forensic experts concluded all the victims found in the cellar at 25 Cromwell Street had been murdered in this location, and that, like Goff, each had been dismembered in this location. 5 victims were murdered and buried in the cellar at Cromwell Street between November 1973 and April 1975. The first of these victims, 15-year-old Carol Ann Cooper, was abducted on November 10, 1973. Cooper lived in the Pines Children's Home in Worcester, and was abducted after spending the evening at a cinema with her boyfriend. She had been waiting for a bus in Warren when she vanished, and was likely dragged into Fred's car, where her face was bound with surgical tape and her arms bound with braiding cloth before she was driven to Cromwell Street. At the West's address, Cooper was suspended from the wooden beams of the cellar ceiling before her abuse and murder. As had been the case with Linda, Cooper died from strangulation or asphyxiation, before her body was dismembered and buried in a shallow, cubical grave in the cellar. Over the following 17 months, 4 further victims between the ages of 15 and 21 suffered a similar fate to that endured by Goff and Cooper, although the disarticulation conducted upon each successive victim, plus the paraphernalia discovered in each shallow grave, suggests each victim was likely subjected to greater abuse and torture than those previously murdered. Following the murder of 18-year-old Juanita Mott in April 1975, Fred concreted over the floor of the entire cellar. He later converted this section of the household into a bedroom for his oldest children, and he and his wife are not known to have committed any further murders until May 1978, when Fred, either with or without Rose's participation but certainly with her knowledge, murdered an 18-year-old lodger named Shirley Robinson. Robinson had first met Fred at the Green Lantern Cafe in April 1977, and had taken lodgings with the Wests the same month. She was heavily pregnant at the time of her murder. Although Rose, herself pregnant at the time, initially boasted to neighbors the child Robinson was carrying was her husband's, she soon developed a deep resentment of Robinson, and the motive for her murder is likely to have been the removal of a threat to the stability of the Wests' relationship. Her body was buried in the garden of 25 Cromwell Street. It was extensively dismembered, but no restraining devices were found with these remains, making a sexual motive for this murder unlikely. The unborn baby had been removed and had several bones missing. Shortly thereafter, Rose unsuccessfully submitted a claim for maternity benefit in Robinson's name with Gloucester Social Services. As had earlier been the case with Charmaine and Linda, Fred and Rose allayed the suspicions of anyone who asked about Robinson's whereabouts by claiming she had relocated to live with her father in West Germany. The final murder Fred and Rose are known to have committed with a definite sexual motive occurred on August 5, 1979. The victim was a 16-year-old named Allison Chambers, who had run away from a local children's home to become the West's live-in nanny in the middle of 1979. Chambers is believed to have lived within their household for several weeks before her murder, and Rose promised Chambers she could live at a rural peaceful farm she claimed she and her husband owned. Her body was also buried in the garden of Cromwell Street, close to the bathroom wall, and although Chambers was likely dismembered, her skeleton was not marked by striations as the earlier victims' bodies had been. In an effort to allay any concerns from Chambers' family, with whom she maintained regular correspondence, Fred and Rose later posted a letter, written by Chambers to her mother prior to her murder, from a Northamptonshire post box. Abuse. The West family, pictured in their Cromwell Street home on the date of Anna Marie West's January 1984 marriage. Heather, aged 13, is at the extreme right. Heather and Mae West became the focus of Fred's incestuous sexual attentions after Anna Marie ran away from home in 1979 after enduring a particularly severe beating from Rose to her stomach just days after being discharged from hospital for treatment of an ectopic pregnancy. The frequency of the abuse endured by Heather and Mae increased when both girls reached puberty. Fred was overt and unapologetic in his conduct, and would justify his actions with a simple explanation: "I made you, I can do what I like with you." He further referred to his intentions to impregnate both his daughters on at least one occasion, and would occasionally force all his children to watch pornography with him. As Heather, Mae, and their younger brother Stephen were very close in age, the trio resolved that if their father asked either of the two girls to be alone in a room with him, they would only do so if at least one other member of the trio were present to avoid either girl being raped. Both girls also developed a regime whereby they would only shower or undress when their father was either out of the house, or as her sister stood guard at the door. Stephen was also informed by his father that he would have to have sex with his mother by the age of 17, in the event his parents evicted him from their home when he was 16. Although the girls were repulsed by their father's behavior, Mae, having once endured Fred's throwing a vacuum cleaner at her when she remonstrated against his fondling her, developed a mechanism whereby she would tolerate Fred sexually fondling her, then jokingly brush aside any efforts he made to take the molestation further, whereas in her autobiography, Mae recollected that Heather was affected quite badly by all of this. Even more than me. A strong suspicion remains that, by 1985 or 1986, Heather had been forced to engage in intercourse with her father, as by the mid-1980s, she developed classic symptoms of the distress felt by victims of child abuse. These included habits of her biting her nails until they bled, drinking alcohol, of warily watching her father through the corner of her eye wherever she was sitting or standing, expressing nervous fragility whenever in the presence of males, her sleep being repeatedly broken by nightmares, and her repeatedly bouncing back and forth as she sat on any chair. This distressful behavior led to Fred and Rose suspecting Heather had lesbian inclinations, and also resulted in her becoming the increasing recipient of taunts from her father, who had never particularly liked Heather, that she was ugly and a bitch. On the occasions Heather remonstrated about the abuse to her mother, Rose would simply laugh at her distress. Heather also expressed to Mae and Stephen her desire to run away from home and live a nomadic lifestyle in the Forest of Dean, and to never again see any human beings. Murder of Heather West. Heather did complain to friends about the abuse she and her siblings endured, and her external signs of psychological distress were noted by several of them. Staff at the Hucklecote Secondary School, which Heather and her siblings attended, are also known to have expressed concern as to why Heather, a studious and obedient pupil, refused to obey orders either to change her clothing for, or shower after, sporting activities. On one occasion, she was forced to take a shower, resulting in her peers and staff noting her arms, legs and torso were covered in welts and bruises in various stages of healing. Heather attempted to excuse these injuries as having been obtained in fights with her siblings, but confided in one close friend that they had been inflicted by her parents, adding that her mother considered her a little bitch who deserved her beatings. By the mid-1980s, rumors of Rose's sex life had reached several of the children's classmates, and although the West children had been instructed never to divulge details of their home lives to their peers, Heather confided to her friends that many of these rumors were true. The father of one of these classmates was a friend of the Wests. As such, word soon reached Fred and Rose that Heather had divulged details of her home life, including details of her mother's promiscuity, to her classmates. Fred was so concerned by these revelations that he began to escort Heather to and from school. After Heather left school in 1986, she applied for numerous jobs in an effort to leave Cromwell Street. By June of the following year, she had pinned her hopes on escaping the household via obtaining a job as a chalet cleaner at a holiday camp in the seaside town of Torquay. She received notification that this application had been unsuccessful on June 18, 1987. In response, she crumpled into tears before her siblings Mae and Stephen. That same evening, her whole family heard Heather sobbing aloud as she attempted to sleep, and according to May, she cried all the way through the night. The following morning, on June 19th, Heather was back to her usual self, looking miserable, biting her nails and sitting on the couch bouncing back and forth as she sat as her siblings left the house to go to school. When Heather's siblings returned home, they were informed Heather had left to accept a job she had previously been refused in Torquay, although Rose told an inquiring neighbor that she and Heather had had a hell of a row, and that Heather had run away from home. Later, to answer their children's questions about why Heather failed to contact or visit her siblings, the parents claimed that Heather had eloped with a lesbian lover. When May and Stephen suggested they report Heather's disappearance to police, Fred changed his story yet again, saying it would be unwise to initiate a search for Heather as she was involved in credit card fraud. On more than one occasion, Fred and Rose persuaded an unknown acquaintance to fake a phone call from Heather to her parents. I mean I thought the bloody world of Heather. So anyway, I got to grips with it after a while, and the first thing that came into my mind was I'm gonna have to take this and sort it out, which I did. All the messes Rose got herself into, I took the fucking rap for them, and helped them out. So anyway, I said, you'll have to tell me exactly what happened. She said that Heather was cut up. Well, I never felt so ill for a few seconds, a few minutes before I could get to grips with myself again, and I said, what on earth did you cut her up for? She said, she wouldn't fit in a dustbin. Now, the thing that makes it hard, is that she cut Heather up and chucked her in a fucking dustbin. Her daughter, in a dustbin. Fred West, 1994. In the years following Heather's disappearance, Fred occasionally jokingly threatened the children that they would end up under the patio like Heather if they either misbehaved or divulged the mistreatment they endured to anyone outside the household. With Rose's approval, he later constructed a barbecue pit immediately opposite where Heather had been buried, and placed a pine table on her grave for the children of the family to sit upon whenever the Wests held family gatherings in their garden. Heather's disappearance, Fred and Rose's constantly changing stories about their daughter's whereabouts, plus their allusions to foul play, ultimately led to police inquiries as to Heather's whereabouts. These inquiries culminated in a search warrant being issued to excavate the West's garden in February 1994. Arrest. In May 1992, Fred asked his 13-year-old daughter, Louise, to bring some bottles to a room on the first floor of their home. Rose was not present in the home at the time. Shortly thereafter, the girl's siblings heard her scream, "No, don't." Later, Fred returned downstairs. Louise was found by her siblings writhing in pain, sobbing that her father had raped and sodomized her, at one stage partially strangling her. When Rose returned home, Louise confided in her mother that she had been raped by Fred. Rose replied, "Oh well. You were asking for it." Over the following weeks, Louise was raped on 3 further occasions, with Rose personally witnessing one of these rapes before following her distressed and bleeding daughter into the bathroom and asking the child, "Well, what did you expect?" Fred also filmed one of these rapes. Several weeks later, Louise garnered the courage to confide in a close friend what her father had done. This friend told her own mother what had happened on August 4th. In response, the friend's mother anonymously informed the police. On August 6, 1992, the police searched the West household on the pretext of searching for stolen property. Although numerous objects of sexual paraphernalia including 99 pornographic videos of both homemade and commercial nature were discovered, police did not find the video depicting the rape of Fred's daughter. The 13-year-old made a full statement through a specially trained solicitor, describing her father's actions, the fact the sexual abuse had begun when she was 11, and that her mother had been casually indifferent to her plight. All the children in the household were placed in foster care the following day. Medical examinations revealed evidence of physical and sexual abuse. The West children also divulged their mother had inflicted most of the physical abuse and that their father frequently said that if they told anyone about the goings-on in the household they would be buried under the patio like their sister Heather. Investigation. Police began a full-scale investigation, eventually leading to Fred being charged with 3 counts of rape, and 1 of buggery, with Rose as an accomplice. She was also charged with child cruelty, inciting her husband to engage in sex with her daughter, and obstructing the police. The Wests were questioned as to the whereabouts of their eldest daughter, and although Fred claimed Heather was alive and well and supporting herself via prostitution, Rose initially claimed to have no knowledge of Heather's whereabouts, or why she had left home. She claimed on August 11 that she could remember now that her daughter had left home at her own persuasion due to Rose's concerns her other children may discover Heather's supposed lesbian inclinations. Rose then added she had also given her daughter £600 to incentivize her to leave the household, before further claiming to have maintained sporadic telephone contact with her daughter over the years. The following day, Rose was granted bail on the condition she did not maintain contact with her children, her stepdaughter, or her husband prior to her upcoming trial. As Fred awaited trial, he was held on remand in Birmingham. Learning that her father had denied any wrongdoing, Anna Marie also contacted police to offer a full statement detailing her experiences as a child. In a statement given to Detective Constable Hazel Savage, Anna Marie recounted the extensive physical, mental, and sexual abuse she had endured as a child at the hands of her father and stepmother, before agreeing to testify against both parents at their upcoming trial. Anna Marie also added she had, for several years, been unsuccessfully attempting to trace her mother Rena and half-sisters Charmaine and Heather. Further inquiries conducted with Anna Marie's husband, Chris Davis, revealed that Heather had confided in him just how unhappy she was shortly before her disappearance, and of her desire to leave home. Davis elaborated that although Heather had not divulged any details about her enduring any sexual abuse, he had been so concerned for her welfare he had offered to confront her parents, and Heather had dissuaded him from doing so, blurting, "For Christ's sake don't, because they'll kill us both." Davis then suggested they might wish to speak with Heather to garner further details of her abuse. In their efforts to gather further evidence, police and social services also spoke with May, who, having spoken with her 13-year-old sister and learned Louise did not wish to see her father charged, initially denied she had endured any molestation as an adolescent. 149 police then focused their attentions on tracing Heather in efforts to corroborate Anna Marie's claims of sexual abuse, but inquiries to the Inland Revenue and the Social Security Department held no records attesting to her being alive. 2 months later, Gloucester Social Services also contacted police to stress their concern over the whereabouts of Heather. This case against the Wests collapsed when Anna Marie and her 13-year-old half-sister Louise declined to testify at the court case on June 7, 1993, with a child rape victim expressing her desire to return to her family, and Anna Marie choosing to withdraw her statement because of her noting the misery of her younger siblings, and her fear of Rose's vindictiveness shortly thereafter. Anna Marie spoke further with D.C. Savage, further emphasizing that her mother Rena and half-sister Charmaine were also missing. Search warrant. Although the Wests were acquitted of all charges, all their younger children remained in foster care, albeit with permitted supervised visitations to Cromwell Street. Despite the Wests claiming to the few relatives from whom they were not already estranged by 1993 that the charges had been fabricated by police, almost all of their remaining family members severed contact with them. Meanwhile, police continued investigating the disappearance of Heather, noting no records existed indicating she was still alive. When Anna Marie was questioned as to the colloquial family joke regarding Heather being buried beneath a patio, she confirmed that the sole time she had heard her father recite this claim, he had immediately burst into laughter, leading to her refusing to take this claim seriously. In retracing Fred's history, police also discovered that although Rena and Charmaine had disappeared in 1971, no missing person report had ever been filed on either of them. D.C. Savage and her colleagues were convinced Heather was dead, and that Fred's repeated statement to his children that her body lay beneath the family patio might be true. On February 23, 1994, Gloucester Police successfully applied for a search warrant authorizing the search of 25 Cromwell Street to locate Heather's remains. When police visited the address on February 24 and showed the warrant to Rose, she turned pale, before becoming hysterical and shouting over her shoulder to her eldest son, "Stephen, get Fred." Rose became contradictory in her informal questioning as to the circumstances surrounding Heather's disappearance. When reminded of these contradictions, she became distraught and abusive, shouting at the officers, "I can't fucking remember. It's a bloody long time ago. What do you think I am? A bloody computer?" Fred had been working in Stroud at the time. Upon hearing of the police's intentions, he assured Stephen he would be home immediately. When Fred arrived 3 hours later, he informed his family of his intention to voluntarily offer a witness statement to police regarding his daughter's whereabouts. Despite Fred's insistence in this statement that Heather had been alive and well, albeit involved in a drugs cartel, and that the claims he and his wife had made as to Heather being buried beneath the family patio were simply rubbish, police were unassuaged. In response, Fred abruptly changed tactics, claiming they simply held a grudge against him due to his 1993 acquittal of the rape of his daughter. That evening, with the search team having left their premises and a uniformed officer remaining at Cromwell Street to guard the excavation site, May and Stephen observed their parents talking in hushed tones as they repeatedly glanced towards the garden from their kitchen window. In the early hours of the following morning, as his son Stephen was about to leave for work, Fred informed him, "Look son, look after Mom and sell the house. I've done something really bad. I want you to go to the papers and make as much money as you can." Shortly thereafter, police returned to Cromwell Street to continue their search for Heather's body. Upon their arrival, Fred indicated his wish to be arrested for Heather's murder and to be taken to Bearland Police Station to provide a full confession. He was then arrested and formally cautioned. Discoveries. At 11:15 that morning, Fred formally admitted to police he had indeed killed his daughter, albeit in an act of manslaughter. He confessed to strangling Heather in a fit of rage, then dismembering her body in the ground floor bathroom with a heavy serrated knife he normally used for cutting slabs of frozen meat. Her remains had been stored in a dustbin as he waited for an opportunity to dig her grave. Fred was insistent his wife had no knowledge of her daughter's murder, claiming he had committed this murder as Rose was preoccupied with one of her clients, adding the fact the search team had not yet unearthed Heather's remains was because they had been excavating the wrong section of his garden. He then volunteered to accompany police to the house to pinpoint the precise location of Heather's body. Upon receipt of this confession, Fred's solicitor, Howard Ogden, and Janet Leach, his appointed appropriate adult, informed May and Stephen their father had confessed to their sister's murder. In response, Stephen slumped against the wall and began sobbing. May entered a state of shock, before stammering that her father had not killed her sister. The following day, February 26th, police began excavating the section of the garden at Cromwell Street where Fred indicated he had buried his daughter's body. Shortly after 4 p.m., police found a human thigh bone protruding from a section of the garden Fred had insisted police need not look in. Excavating the section of the garden where Fred had indicated he had buried his daughter's body, investigators discovered a mass of jumbled human remains encased in the remnants of a bin bag and intertwined with 2 lengths of rope. These dismembered remains were taken to the police headquarters for further examination, where they were determined to be those of a young woman, with 1 kneecap and several phalanges missing. The decedent's fingernails were discovered in a pile, suggesting they may have been torn from her fingers as a means of torture. Several hours later, the body was identified via dental records as being that of Heather West. That evening, having been formally charged with his daughter's murder and questioned as to why police had also discovered a 3rd thigh bone, Fred confessed there were 2 further sets of human remains in his garden, and agreed to return to Cromwell Street to reveal the locations of both graves, one of whom he named as Shirley Robinson, whom he described as being a former tenant and a lesbian who had been heavily pregnant with his child at the time of her 1978 murder, the other victim he described, incorrectly, as being Shirley's mate, but either could not or would not elaborate as to her identity. Both sets of remains were discovered on February 28th, and Fred was charged with both murders 2 days later. Having discovered 3 sets of human remains in the garden, a decision was made to thoroughly search the entire property. Rose was placed into a safe house in the nearby town of Disley as police commenced their search inside 25 Cromwell Street. Informed of this fact, and with the formal interviews conducted by the investigative team lasting up to 16 hours each day and including persistent questioning as to the whereabouts of his first wife Rena and stepdaughter Charmaine, Fred authorized his solicitor to pass a note he had written to the leader of the murder investigation, Superintendent John Bennett of the Gloucestershire Police. This note dated 4 March read, "I, Frederick West, authorize my solicitor, Howard Ogden, to advise Superintendent Bennett that I wish to admit a further, approximate, 9 killings, expressly Charmaine, Rena, Linda Goff and others to be identified. F. West? Questioned further as to his claims, Fred calmly explained there were a further 5 bodies buried in his cellar, and a 6th body beneath a ground floor bathroom. Most of these victims, Fred claimed, had been hitchhikers or girls he had murdered in the 1970s after picking them up at bus stops. Initially, Fred claimed these 6 victims had been killed when they had threatened to inform Rose of his infidelity with women, and that he had transported their bodies to Cromwell Street to abuse, dismember, and then bury in shallow graves. The dismemberment, Fred claimed, had made it easier to bury the remains in shallow, cubical graves, and he agreed to return to Cromwell Street to indicate precisely where he had buried each victim. Between 5 and March 8, police found 6 further bodies of young females at 25 Cromwell Street. Each victim had been extensively mutilated, and each body bore evidence of having been subjected to extreme sexual abuse prior to the act of murder. For example, the 3rd set of remains discovered in the cellar was found with a length of cloth wrapped around the skull, and an oval of adhesive tape 16 inches in circumference found with the remains had likely been used to gag this victim, whose ankles and wrists were also bound with a large section of rope. Also found in this grave was a large, serrated knife. The 2nd set of remains was found with a section of tubing twisted into a U shape alongside her severed limbs, and her skull was found encased in adhesive tape which had been wrapped around the section where her face had been 11 or 12 times, with a narrow plastic tube inserted where the nasal cavities had been in an effort to allow her to breathe prior to her murder. Each set of remains was missing numerous bones, particularly phalanges. When questioned, Fred refused to divulge the whereabouts of the bones missing from each set of remains, or the reason for their absence. January 6, Mary Bastholm, 15. A teenage waitress at a cafe Fred frequented. Bastholm was abducted from a bus stop on Bristol Road, Gloucester. Fred confessed to police he had killed Bastholm after raping her in his car. She is believed to have been buried in Bishop's Cleeve. Police were unable to charge Fred with this crime as they had no evidence. Her body has never been found. 1971. June 20th, Charmaine West, 8, Fred's stepdaughter. Charmaine was killed by Rose shortly before Fred's release from Leyhill Prison on June 24th, likely in a fit of domestic violence. 57. Her remains were initially stored in a cellar at Midland Road before Fred buried the child's body in the rear garden of the flat. August, Catherine Rena Costello, 27. Rena is believed to have traveled to the Wests at 25 Midland Road to either inquire about or obtain custody of her 2 daughters in mid to late August 1971. It is believed Fred killed Rena to avoid any investigation into Charmaine's whereabouts. She is believed to have been strangled to death by Fred before her extensively mutilated body was buried in Letterbox Field. 1973. April 20th, Linda Goff, 19. The first sexually motivated killing the Wests are known to have committed together. Goff was a lodger at 25 Cromwell Street and shared sex partners with Rose. Following her disappearance, Goff's mother traveled to Cromwell Street to inquire as to her daughter's whereabouts, and saw Rose wearing her daughter's clothes and slippers. She was informed that Linda had moved to find work in Weston-super-Mare. Linda Goff's remains were buried in an inspection pit beneath a garage, which was later converted into a bathroom. November 10th, Carol Ann Cooper, 15. Cooper had been placed into care following her mother's death in 1966. She was last seen alive by her boyfriend in a suburb of Warndon boarding a bus to her grandmother's home. Fred referred to Cooper as Scarhand in reference to a recent firework burn she had sustained. Cooper was the final victim unearthed from the cellar. Her skull was bound with surgical tape and her dismembered limbs bound with cord and braiding cloth. December 27th, Lucy Partington, 21. Partington was an Exeter University student and the cousin of novelist Martin Amis. 218. She was abducted from a bus stop along the A435. Her precise date of death may have been 1 week after her disappearance, as Fred admitted himself into the casualty unit of the Gloucester Royal Hospital with a serious laceration of his right hand on January 3, possibly sustained as he dismembered Partington's body. Her body was discovered in the Cromwell Street cellar on March 6, 1994. 1974. April 16, Therese Zegan Thaler, 21. A sociology student at Greenwich Community College. Zegan Thaler was abducted by the Wests as she hitchhiked from South London to Holyhead. Fred mistook her Swiss accent to be a Dutch one, and always referred to her as either the Dutch girl or Tulip. She was reported missing to Scotland Yard by her family in Switzerland when communication from their daughter ceased. Fred later further concealed Siegenthaler's remains by building a false chimney breast on her grave. November 15, Shirley Hubbard, 15. A foster child abducted from a Droitwich bus stop close to the River Severn as she traveled home from a date. Aged 15 when murdered, Hubbard had been attending work experience in Worcester, and was last seen by her boyfriend, having promised to meet him the next day. Hubbard's dismembered remains were found in a section of the cellar known to the family as the Marilyn Monroe area. Her head had been completely covered in tape, with a 1/8 of an inch diameter rubber tube inserted 3 inches into her nasal cavity to enable her to breathe. 1975. April 12, Juanita Mott, 18. Mott had been a former lodger at 25 Cromwell Street but was living with a family friend in Newent when she disappeared. Mott is believed to have been abducted by the Wests as she hitchhiked along the B4215. In his subsequent confessions to police, Fred would refer to Mott as the girl from Newent. 1978. May 10, Shirley Robinson, 18. Another former lodger at 25 Cromwell Street. Robinson was bisexual and engaged in casual sex with Fred and Rose. At the time of her disappearance, she had been 8 months pregnant with Fred's child, and her baby boy had been due to be born on June 11. No sexual motive existed for this murder, and the prosecution contended at Rose's trial that Robinson had been murdered as her pregnancy threatened the stability of the Wests' relationship. Fred had originally planned to sell their baby to a childless couple and had photographs taken with Robinson for this purpose. 1979. August 5, Allison Chambers, 16. Chambers had been placed into foster care at the age of 14, and had repeatedly absconded from Jordan's Brook house. She became acquainted with the Wests in mid-1979, and Fred later claimed to his solicitor that Chambers had died as a result of Rose becoming too bloody vicious with her. Her dismembered body, missing several bones and with a leather belt loop beneath her jaw and tight at the top of her head, was buried in the garden of Cromwell Street. This was the final murder where a definite sexual motive was established. 1987. June 19, Heather West, 16. Heather was likely to have been murdered because Fred and Rose considered her efforts to leave the household as a threat, as she divulged to her classmates the extensive physical and sexual abuse which occurred at Cromwell Street. Fred claimed he had not intended to kill his daughter, but carpet fibers found on 2 lengths of rope, discovered with her remains, suggested that she had been restrained and subjected to a sexual assault prior to her murder. Her body was dismembered with a heavy serrated knife and later buried in a hole in the garden which Fred had his son dig, under the pretense of installing a fish pond. The 1994 police investigation into Heather's disappearance led to the discovery of her body, and the arrest of both her parents. Footnotes. As well as the 12 confirmed victims, police firmly believe Fred is also responsible for the 1968 disappearance of 15-year-old Mary Bastholm, but to date no body has been found. West's son, Stephen, has said he firmly believes the missing teenager was an early victim of his father, as Fred had openly boasted of having committed Bastholm's murder while on remand. In May 2021, police announced their intentions to excavate the grounds of a cafe in Gloucester after receiving information that the body of Mary Bastholm may have been buried at this location. This search yielded no human remains. At the time of her disappearance, Bastholm worked at this cafe and Fred is known to have frequented the premises. Furthermore, he is known to have conducted repair work on the drains of this cafe in late 1967. No forensic evidence linked Fred to the murder of Anne McFall, and he always denied killing her. However, her body had been extensively dismembered, and was missing several phalange bones. Furthermore, the cubic dimensions of the grave in which her body was buried matched the modus operandi of Fred's later murders. Aftermath. Fred's body was cremated in Coventry on March 29, 1995 in a funeral that was attended by just 4 of his children. In a 5-minute service, in which no hymns were sung, the Reverend Robert Simpson quoted sections of Psalm 23, then added a solemn reminder to those present that they must also remember everyone else who has also suffered because of these tragic events. His ashes are believed to have been scattered at the Welsh seaside resort of Berry Island, a location he had regularly visited both as a child and as an adult with his family. After the 1994 arrest of their parents, the four youngest West children, born between 1978 and 1983, were given new identities to protect them from the notoriety of their family. Each child remained in foster care. The remains of Charmaine and Reno were cremated in Kettering. At the insistence of Anna Marie West, mother and daughter shared the same coffin, and no roses were to be brought to the service by any mourners. As a direct result of her tenacity in investigating the Wests, D.C. Hazel Savage was placed upon the annual New Year's Honors List. The following year, she was awarded an MBE. Cromwell Street, seen here in 2011. The location where 25 Cromwell Street once stood is behind the bollards to the lower right. The West's house in Cromwell Street was demolished in October 1996, with every piece of debris destroyed to discourage potential souvenir hunters. 244 It had been referred to in the press as the House of Horrors. The site was later redeveloped into a public pathway. Fred's younger brother, John, hanged himself in the garage of his Gloucester home in November 1996. At the time of his suicide, he had been awaiting the jury verdict in his trial for the alleged multiple rapes of his niece, Anna Marie, and another underage girl at Cromwell Street in the 1970s. In March 1996, Rose announced her intentions to appeal against her sentence, contending extensive press coverage had rendered witness testimony unreliable, that no physical evidence existed to attest she had participated in any of the murders, that the final instructions delivered by the judge to the jury had been biased in favor of the prosecution, and that undue weight had been given to the similar fact evidence introduced at her trial. This appeal was rejected by the Lord Chief Justice, Lord Taylor of Gosforth, who contended Rose had received a fair trial and efficient legal representation. In July 1997, then Home Secretary Jack Straw subjected Rose to a whole-life tariff, effectively denying her any possibility of parole. 248 Rose again announced that she would appeal against her sentence via her solicitor Leo Goatley in October 2000. In September 2001, she announced her intentions to abandon her appeals, stating she would never feel free even if released. She maintains her innocence in any of the murders. Both of Rose's oldest biological children and her stepdaughter, Anna Marie, initially visited her in prison on a regular basis, although by 2006, she had ceased contact with them after May began asking questions about her culpability in the murders. Rose justified her decision with the explanation, "I was never a parent then and could never be now." The sole visitor Rose continues to receive in prison is Anna Marie, who later changed her name to Anne Marie. The body of the West's former friend and housemate, Terence Crick, was found in his car in the Scarborough district of Hackness in January 1996. He was 48 years old. Crick had become acquainted with Fred while he had lived at the Lake House Caravan Park in 1969. He had reported Fred to the authorities on several occasions after having been shown surgical instruments Fred claimed to have used to perform illegal abortions, and Polaroid images of the subject's genitals he claimed to have taken immediately after the procedures. Crick had further informed authorities Fred had asked him to assist in finding pregnant girls to perform abortions upon. Crick had believed the information he had provided to police was ignored as Fred was a known police informant. The stress and guilt Crick had felt over the fact the information he had provided had not resulted in charges being brought apparently led him to take his own life. An inquest later recorded a verdict of suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning. In 2004, one of the West's youngest children, Barry, claimed to have witnessed the murder of his sister Heather. According to Barry, who was 7 at the time, Fred and Rose had restrained, then sexually and physically abused Heather, before Rose had repeatedly stamped upon her head until she ceased to move. In 1999, Anna Marie West attempted suicide by drowning herself in the River Severn. Stephen West is also known to have made a suicide attempt in 2002, by attempting to hang himself. In 2004, he was jailed for 9 months for having unlawful sex with a 14-year-old girl on multiple occasions. The couple's youngest son, Barry, took his own life via a suspected drug overdose in October 2020 at the age of 40. He is known to have battled a drug addiction and psychiatric problems as a result of the abuse he witnessed and endured as a child.